There are reports of tensions and frustrations inside the White House and the office of Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, the reports claim the White House sees dysfunction and a lack of focus. The pushback from the Vice President's office is that she is not properly prepared and sidelined on critical issues, according to those reports. Lauren Wright is a Princeton University professor who focuses on the presidency, executive power, and women in politics, and she joins us now. So Doctor, I'll begin with this question. Do you believe that there is truth about these reports of this tension?
I do. I mean, these reports, and there are many that have come out at this point, tend to be very well sourced, even if it's anonymous sources. Getting anywhere between 10 and 30 people in the vice president's orbit to talk about these tensions is a big red flag, frankly. And you can compare that to the West Wing, which has been relatively leak proof. And so I think the sourcing itself indicates somewhat of a level of disorganization or tension, whatever you might call it. And frankly, these reports have existed back to Vice President Harris's presidential bid, back to her time as Attorney General and a senator in California. So yes, the number of them is certainly concerning.
You know, Grandma always used to say, never point your finger at someone else because the thumb is always pointing back to you. Earlier this year, the vice president was supposed to be in charge of a number of major issues, including voting rights and immigration. Those were pretty big issues, a pretty big platform. So is it that they're not paying enough attention to her, or that she blew it?
No, I think there actually is an extraordinary amount of attention on the vice president because of the historic nature of her role. There is an outsized amount of attention on her, and that can be great if the White House wants to bring attention to a certain issue, but it can also be a ton of scrutiny. And as we've talked about on the show before, women of color in particular have more trouble in this area. Sometimes they're judged according to different standards, tougher standards. However, if we set that aside, it's really impossible to treat all of these issues that Vice President Harris is working on as the same. Immigration, for instance, is an issue where she has a ton of credibility, or at least a ton of experience as a senator from a border state. So, you know, it's hard to think of someone who would be more qualified to deal with that issue. Whereas something like voting rights, as you indicated, is a really tough move in Congress right now. There's a ton of institutional obstacles to progress there, but there have been these unforced errors along the way. There have been questions about how the vice president handles tough interview questions, handles press conferences. And so we need to recognize the very difficult position she's in, while also asking, I think, very legitimate questions about is she a viable contender in the future, and what is driving this somewhat low popularity compared to her predecessors.
Is it a safe comparison to look at her as we did Hillary Clinton during the early days of the Clinton administration, when she wanted to remake the position of First Lady, versus Hillary Clinton in the latter parts of the Obama administration as the former Secretary of State?
You know, I think it's very different. And this is actually something I've studied a lot and I wrote a lot about in my book about presidential spouses. Spouses are different than vice presidents because while they are both top surrogates, there's more leeway with regard to what spouses do. And that actually does apply to Hillary Clinton. What we don't like when presidential spouses do is there seems to be a negative public reaction when they have a direct role in policymaking. That's totally different from vice presidents, who we actually expect to be somewhat active players in the administration, especially in modern times. If you look at Dick Cheney as sort of the first person to have an outsized role as a vice president in the administration. And so there is an expectation for Vice President Harris to be very involved. However, it's really hard to tell, again, what's driving public impressions of her, because she is the first woman vice president and she is also the first person of color in that role.
Interesting question for you. Is the bar for the vice president being set too high because she is the first person of color and female in that role, or is it being set too low?
Well, I'm not sure about high or low, but I will say, and I've been talking about this since Vice President Harris was selected as the president's running mate. There will be tougher standards applied to her. But as long as people are considering her to be the heir apparent to the Democratic nomination for president, whether it's 2024 or 2028, that expectation has been there. There will be a standard applied to her. That's the standard for president of the United States, not vice president of the United States. So if we assume that she is in fact interested in running again, or she is in fact interested in staying a national figure in American politics, then that bar is not going anywhere. Whether it's fair or not is a different question, but it is going to be there. And if the vice president and her team want to succeed, they will have to deal with those standards, whether fair or unfair.
20 seconds, but Barack Obama had to choose between Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. Will Joe Biden have to choose between Susan Rice and Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris?
Oh gosh, I would be very surprised if he changes course at this point. And actually, despite a lot of the criticism of the West Wing not giving Harris and her team enough support, I think the fact that she's in this position shows that Joe Biden has a ton of confidence in her and thinks she is the future of American politics. He chose carefully. So I would expect her to stay in that role. But if her popularity stays the same right now, that will in fact be an obstacle going forward.
It is only November till tomorrow. Princeton University
Yes.
professor Lauren Wright. Dr. Wright, as always, thanks for being with us.